Hi, my name is Jake Aziz, and today I'm going to be talking about the intonation of Malagasy. The purpose of this presentation is to present my preliminary model of Malagasy intonation in the autosegmental metrical framework. This model will describe the way that syntactic and prosodic constituents are closely related in Malagasy, and in particular, I want to focus on the ways that Malagasy uses pitch accents to demarcate these constituents. First, a bit of background on Malagasy. Malagasy is an Austronesian language spoken in Madagascar and the nearby island of Mayotte by about 25 million speakers. Because of its rare VOS word order, most of the attention that Malagasy gets in linguistics is because of its syntax. However, there's lots to be said about its phonetics and phonology. Regarding word prosody, Malagasy has been argued to have stress. Stress can appear on the final, penultimate, or antepenultimate syllable of the surface form, and minimal pairs do exist. For example, lalana with antepenultimate stress means road, whereas lalana with penultimate stress means law. There's some argument to be made that stress is regular and postlexical, but for our purposes, we're only interested in where stress is realized. There's also a small literature on the intonation of Malagasy. Early descriptions of Malagasy intonation describe these kinds of intonation groups, which overlap closely with major syntactic constituents. These constituents are marked with a rise in pitch at the right edge. There's an even smaller amount of research on Malagasy under the autosegmental metrical framework, for example, a handful of sentences spoken by only a couple speakers. However, one study, Barjam in 2003, describes this rise in pitch as a pitch accent, which he labels as L plus H star. However, there is some debate as to which syntactic constituents actually coincide with prosodic constituents. The first analysis by Barjam argues that both the predicate and the subject are marked with intonation, and he argues for the L plus H star pitch accent on the rightmost stressed syllable of each. However, Frascarelli argues that only the predicate is marked with intonation, in particular the L star plus H pitch accent. This is supported by perceptual evidence, for example, a study by Ronja Riswa in 1990, which asked Malagasy speakers to identify syllables within an utterance that they perceived as being prominent. And in fact, most speakers only identified the rightmost stressed syllable of the predicate as being prominent, but not the subject. Now, that's not to say that there was no tonal event going on at all on the subject. However, under traditional analyses, especially under the autosegmental metrical model, we wouldn't consider that to be a pitch accent because of its lack of prominence. Additionally, both authors argue for a low percent boundary tone at the end of declarative sentences. So with these two competing analyses in the literature, I wanted to frame my research around two main questions, which I will attempt to answer today. First, what is the relationship between syntactic and prosodic constituents in Malagasy? The answer to this question will help to settle the debate over which syntactic constituents coincide with prosodic ones. Second, I am asking what the role that pitch accents play in marking constituent boundaries is. This question will help us to understand the ways that Malagasy marks prosodic and syntactic constituents using intonation. In order to come up with my preliminary model of Malagasy declarative intonation, I collected data from 6 speakers, 5 male and 1 female, all of whom were born in and continue to live in the Central Highlands of Madagascar. Participants each read a number of sentences, but today I'm going to be focusing on just 20 of these, which were simple declaratives. In total, I ended up with 118 tokens as 2 were removed for speech errors. The sentences varied in their syntax, especially with respect to the number of words in the predicate and the subject. The reason for this was to test the hypothesis that these constituents are marked with a single pitch accent. So, for example, does a predicate with multiple arguments have the same number of pitch accents as a predicate with only a verb? They also varied in their expected stress. This was in order to evaluate whether any rise in pitch was actually co-occurring with the stressed syllable, and not, for example, on the final syllable regardless of stress. In order to develop an analysis, I first looked for relative high and low points in the pitch track, and then identified which pitch events were contrastive and which were conditioned by phonological context in order to categorize these tones. So with that said, let me start my own analysis by addressing the question of the pitch accent. Now, recall that the location of pitch accents in Malagasy is controversial, as some authors propose a pitch accent on both the predicate and the subject, whereas others argue that there's only one on the predicate. In fact, I found that both arguments have some amount of truth to them. First, L plus H star marks the right edge of the predicate. That's to say, the rightmost stressed syllable of the predicate has a prominent rising pitch accent. This is regardless of the length of the predicate, whether it's just a single verb, or a verb with multiple objects, or a verb with an adverb. There is only ever one pitch accent. It is on the word furthest to the right. There is some phonetic variation. For example, this pitch accent can be realized as L star plus H, where the low target is reached within the stressed syllable, and L plus H star with the delayed peak, where the high peak is realized on the syllable following the stressed syllable. The distribution of these tones appears to be allophonic, but because of the small number of tokens that I'm working with in this preliminary analysis, I'll refrain from making any generalizations just yet. So here's an example of the L plus H star pitch accent that appears on the right edge of the predicate. In this example, the predicate consists of the words give water you, where the word you has a pitch accent on the final syllable. Because of this, you can see that the F0 starts low throughout the sentence until that final stressed syllable where pitch rises sharply. This is the F0 contour that I've labeled L plus H star, and it sounds like this. This is another example of the L plus H star pitch accent. In this example, the rightmost word of the predicate, which consists of the words watch the sea, is realized with penultimate stress. As a result, you can see that the pitch accent is realized on this syllable, showing how this rise in pitch is associated with the rightmost stressed syllable of the constituent, wherever that may be. Note that in these examples, you'll see a pitch accent with lowercase letters, and that's a notation that I'll get to shortly. This is what this sentence sounds like. As with predicates, most subject-noun phrases in Malagasy are also marked with the pitch accent on the rightmost stressed syllable. However, in over half of all utterances, this pitch accent is not prominent. Now, under the AM framework, it might seem unusual to talk about a non-prominent pitch accent, since pitch accents typically mark prominence. But in my preliminary model, I'm considering this tonal event to be a pitch accent and not a boundary tone for two reasons. First, just looking at the F0 track, there's a rise in pitch that looks similar to the pitch accent seen on the predicate, but with a lower F0 peak. As well, these tones appear only on the rightmost stressed syllable of the subject, and this association with stress is why I've decided to tentatively label this tone as a pitch accent. However, as I mentioned, these tones are not prominent. For one, acoustic cues such as intensity indicate that the syllables that bear these tones are no louder than other syllables. Additionally, my own non-native ears do not perceive the syllables as being prominent, and while my judgment is not as valuable as that of a native speaker, this judgment is in line with Ronja Riswa's perception study, which showed that native speakers rarely perceive prominence on the subject. Looking at other data, it becomes clear that the non-prominent pitch accent doesn't necessarily mark the subject, but rather whatever constituent is in the IP final position. Because Malagasy has VOS order, in most cases this is the subject. However, Malagasy allows some adverbs to appear in the sentence final position, and when this is the case, the adverb phrase is marked with the non-prominent pitch accent, while the subject pitch accent receives the normal prominent pitch accent, indicating that non-prominence marks the intonational phrase boundary, and not a specific syntactic constituent. So as you can see here, when the subject is not in the sentence final position, the pitch accent is still prominent, whereas the pitch accent on the adverb loses its prominence, labeled here as lowercase L plus H star, as it marks the intonational phrase boundary. In addition to pitch accents, Malagasy also marks some constituent boundaries with boundary tones. In about half of all IP medial intermediate phrases, which in most cases is the predicate, there is a low boundary tone, labeled L-, where pitch falls following the pitch accent to the low end of the speaker's pitch range. In most cases, this low boundary tone is associated with the final syllable of the intermediate phrase, but may be delayed until the following syllable if the preceding pitch accent is realized on the final syllable of the intermediate phrase, or if its peak is delayed. This suggests that Malagasy prohibits the realization of more than one tonal event on the same syllable, and that the realization of the pitch accent is more important than the boundary tone, and so the boundary tone is delayed until a later syllable. This also shows that while syntactic constituents and prosodic constituents generally coincide, it's not always a one-to-one mapping, at least phonetically. In other cases, the L- boundary tone may not be realized at all. This occurs when there is less than two syllables between one pitch accent and the next. Again, it's presumed that this is because the L- boundary tone and the low target of the following L plus H star pitch accent are competing for the same syllable, and the pitch accent wins. There's also a low boundary tone at the end of the intonational phrase, following the final pitch accent. This is labeled L%. Phonetically, while F0 does fall, it doesn't fall as far as previous low targets, perhaps indicating that this boundary tone is partially undershot. When the final syllable of the utterance is stressed, there's no boundary tone realized at all. Again, presumably, this is because Malagasy prohibits two tones from being realized on the same syllable, and the pitch accent wins out of the boundary tone, leaving the boundary tone with no syllable to be realized on. So in this utterance, you can see examples of the intermediate phrase final L-, as well as the IP final L%. It's a bit hard to separate the L- from the following L plus H star, but if you look closely, you can see that the fall in pitch actually occurs in two steps. First, steeply toward the L- target, and then toward the L plus H star at a more shallow angle. With all of these facts considered, I can propose my preliminary model for Malagasy declarative intonation in the autosegmental metrical tradition. The model aims to encompass the most important details about Malagasy prosodic structure, in particular, the way that Malagasy uses pitch accents to mark constituent boundaries. I'm considering Malagasy declaratives to form intonational phrases, which are made up of multiple intermediate phrases. In the present dataset, these intermediate phrases correspond to the syntactic constituents of the predicate, the subject, and any predicate external adverbials. However, for future research, I expect that other major constituents may form intermediate phrases as well. IP medial intermediate phrases are demarcated with a pitch accent, most commonly L plus H star, in addition to a low boundary tone. The final intermediate phrase is marked with the non-prominent tone, which I've called small L plus H star. Finally, the entire intonational phrase is demarcated with a low boundary tone, which is frequently truncated. Now, for those of you who are familiar with intonational models that look like this, mine might look a bit funny. In particular, the way that constituent boundaries are marked with both a pitch accent and a boundary tone. This is, of course, what makes Malagasy intonation so unique and interesting, and it's worth discussing a bit more. First, let's return to the beginning of my presentation when I mentioned that there is some debate over whether subjects are marked with a pitch accent in Malagasy. Under my analysis, I've described a pitch accent on the subject just as Bartram did. However, this pitch accent is typically non-prominent, which is in line with Ronja-Riswa's perception study and may explain why other analyses don't posit a pitch accent on the subject. Second, to demarcate prosodic constituents with a pitch accent is a typologically rare occurrence. It has been observed in languages like French, as well as Niuean, another Austronesian language with possible VOS word order. However, in general, descriptions of languages that do this are almost non-existent because, at least according to the theory, pitch accents mark prominence and not boundaries, as that role is reserved for boundary tones. Now this brings me to my next point, which is that in most cases, Malagasy predicates are marked at the right edge with both a pitch accent and a boundary tone. Now this is unusual because both tones seem to have the same function, so it begs the question, why both? Finally, the third unusual feature about Malagasy is this non-prominent small L plus H star tone. This is unusual as I'm not aware of any other language that marks intonational phrase boundaries with non-prominence. In any case, the data presented here show that Malagasy intonation has multiple features that are not easily accounted for under current theoretical assumptions, and pending additional research may cause us to rethink what is and isn't possible in intonational theory.